Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to reconvene our meeting. We had a closed session before this meeting, and now we're back into open, and we're going to start this off with the singing of our national anthem. O Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love in all of us command. With glowing hearts we see thee rise, the true north, strong and free. From far and wide, O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. God keep our land glorious and free. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Okay. May I have a motion to adopt the minutes of our previous council meeting? Councillor Andrews, seconded by Deputy Mayor McIntosh. Any discussion on the previous minutes? All in favor? Thank you. Okay, we're now going to have a statutory public meeting. Deputy Mayor McIntosh is going to take the chair for this.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just a couple of housekeeping items. The purpose of this public meeting is to inform and provide the public with the opportunity to ask questions or to express views with respect to the town's proposed development charge bylaw, an underlying background study as required pursuant to Section 12 of the Development Charges Act. The members of council are here to observe and listen to your comments. However, they will not make any decisions this evening. The town requests that you please sign in if you wish to be on record regarding this matter. The format for this public meeting is as follows. Andrew Grundela, Principal of Watson and Associates Economics Limited, will present the purpose and details of the public meeting and any further relevant information. Following this, the public and council can obtain clarification, ask questions, and express their views. Watsons and Associates will attempt to answer questions or respond to concerns this evening. If this is not possible, staff will follow up and obtain this information. Responses will be provided when the matter is brought forward and evaluated by council at a later date. So the following presentation is by Watsons and Associates.
Thank you. So as per the introduction, the intent of the presentation this evening is a statutory requirement under the Development Charges Act to hold at least one public meeting before considering adopting a new bylaw. And so to place development charges in some context, what development charges are is a discretionary mechanism that council has available to you to fund growth-related demand for increase in service that would arise from new development, recognizing that existing taxpayers already have a sufficient level of service provided to them to meet their needs. And so the scope of development charges is to assist the municipality in funding those capital costs of expansion so that they would be paid for by the new homeowners and non-residential development that demand those services, and then use those as a source of funds through the municipality's capital budget to pay for those capital needs. And the town has a long history of development charges in imposing these bylaws. The most recent bylaw was last imposed in 2014 and came into effect on September 1st of that year. Under the Development Charges Act, that bylaw has a 5-year statutory life, and so all municipalities who want to continue to impose these charges have to undertake a statutory public process, prepare a DC background study, at least within that 5-year period, to allow you to adopt a new bylaw to continue to impose these charges. And so in that regard, recognizing that your current bylaw would expire on September the 1st, we've worked with staff to identify the anticipated capital needs related to the underlying development. The detailed background study was prepared and released on the municipality's website on June the 26th to provide information for individuals who may have questions in that regard. Also, we met with the development community last week to advise them of the findings and the proposals within the background study and the bylaw. And so before summarizing the background study, I wanted to provide some context in terms of the legislation. Firstly, the Development Charges Act, which is the authority municipalities have to impose these charges, is quite prescriptive in the methodology that must be adhered to in determining the charges and the underlying policies that govern the bylaw. This illustration, again, which is provided in further detail in the background study, explains that it starts by looking at the anticipated development over the prescribed period of time, then considers the increase in need for service, having regard for council's expression in that regard, whether that be through the municipality's prior 2014 background study, capital budgets, master plans, and other strategic documents that inform that increase in need and the demands of new development. Also, the requirement that the municipality, in addressing that increase in need, must have regard for your existing level of service over the last 10 years, and that forms a maximum level of investment that can be considered. And so what's noteworthy within the current legislation is that the way the Act is drafted today is it identifies certain services that are ineligible. So you will see detailed in the background study that services related to cultural and entertainment facilities, tourism facilities, contributions towards hospitals, the acquisition of parkland, administrative facilities, costs related to landfill and incineration, those are all deemed to be ineligible services. So even if you had growth-related needs in that regard, you would not be able to impose DCs. What we'll see in a moment is that the province has recently provided royal assent to an amendment to the Development Charges Act that will now change that focus going forward. And we'll explain how we're addressing that in this background study. So once we've established those eligible services and estimated what those needs are, we then must estimate what the actual capital costs are that are expected at this time to meet those needs over the forecast period. And then having regard for those deductions you see in the gold boxes on the right-hand side of the illustration, we must quantify if there's a benefit to the existing community that is inherent in those costs, if there's any anticipated grants or subsidies towards those capital needs. And lastly, for what the Act defines as soft services, you can only recover up to 90% of the growth-related costs. So there's a 10% deduction that needs to be funded from a non-DC source. Having made those deductions, then that provides us with the underlying capital needs that then inform the charges that would be imposed on various types of development as they move through the development process. Those monies would be collected, deposited into a reserve fund, again, to be used as a source of funds when those projects come through the municipality's capital budget process. So that is the current legislation today. As you may be aware, the province introduced Bill 108 in the legislature on May 2nd, and that received royal assent on June 6th. The most notable change that's identified in that legislation is that while I mentioned earlier, the Act is drafted to identify ineligible services, and so by extension, if it's not one of those ineligible services, a DC can be imposed. The emphasis is now changed. And so when that legislation is proclaimed to put these sections fully into force, as you see identified in the bullet under the DC eligible services, those are the only services for which DCs will be permitted going forward. So once that is fully proclaimed, municipalities will only be able to impose DCs for water, wastewater, and stormwater, for roads and related public works, for costs related to transit, fire, policing, ambulance, and waste diversion. So as commonly referred to in the legislation, soft services for services such as parks, recreation, library, for example, would no longer be eligible to be included under a DC. What municipalities will have in place of that, however, is that you will be able to impose what's referred to as a community benefits charge under the new authorities of the Planning Act to recover those costs of service. Again, we're still awaiting regulation to put those into force. And so there are some transitionary provisions that you'll see identified in the DC background study in that regard. And we'll talk about those a bit as well. Also, other notable changes that will come into effect, presumably in the year 2020, is that while development charges today are calculated, imposed at the time of building permit issuance, in the future, if an applicant is coming through a site plan approval under the Planning Act or a zoning bylaw amendment approval under the Planning Act, they will in essence freeze the charges that were in place at the time that the planning application was submitted, and they will be locked in at those rates for up to 2 years after the planning approval to impose the charges at those potentially lower rates than what would be identified in the future. And then lastly, what we also see identified is that there are certain types of development that while developments today would pay these charges at the time of building permit issuance, in the future when this is proclaimed, if you are developing rental housing, certain types of commercial development, industrial development, or institutional development, the developer will only pay 1/6 of that charge at the time of occupancy, and then subsequently each year after that for the following 5 years, with the municipality being able to apply interest on those payments. And if a DC was being imposed on a not-for-profit housing development, that installment period would be for 21 installments over 20 years. So those are the notable changes, but as you see identified in this slide, very few sections of that amending act are actually in force today. The majority of that we expect will come into force with the regulations in the fall, and be in effect in 2020. And what the province is proposing under those draft regulations is that municipalities like yourselves will have the option that while you need to pass a new bylaw at this stage in time, you can elect to maintain the soft services under your 2014 bylaw, and even though that bylaw will expire, you'll be able to collect those amounts for those soft services, in this case for parks, recreation, library, parking, for example, even though that bylaw has expired. And what will happen is in adopting this new bylaw for hard services, you will transition those soft services under your 2014 bylaw into a community benefits charge over the course of the fiscal year of 2020. So what is being proposed, as you'll see in this presentation, is simply to adjust the hard service components of the charge. The soft service of the charge would continue at the current rates, and you would transition to a community benefits charge in 2020 once that's more fully described through the regulation and put into force. And so in summarizing the details of the DC background study, we've identified a growth forecast that looks at the amount of available land supply over the longer build-out period to govern the hard service costs related to water, wastewater, roads, for example. The soft services that are considered in here, at least with respect to fire, for example, are considered looking at a shorter 10-year forecast period. The anticipated growth that remains within the designated urban area is approximately 2,900 additional residential units, which would see the municipality's population grow to just over 35,000 persons by that point in time. And similarly, the full development of the employment lands would see employment jobs increase by about 642 over the same period, requiring the development of about 537,000 square feet of gross floor area to accommodate that demand. In addition, in the background study, what you'll see is that while the majority of services are being provided for over this broader municipal-wide forecast period, there are also other sub-geographies for which localized works of roads, water, wastewater, and storm are also being proposed to be maintained on an area-specific basis, consistent with the municipality's practice going back to 2009. And those are summarized on these tables and in further detail in Appendix A of the background study. And so in identifying the various services that are eligible and would be impacted by new development, again, as I mentioned earlier, we've consulted municipal staff and the related studies and expressions of council. The services that you see presented in the background study and the proposed bylaw identify needs related to roads and public works, so costs related to road improvements, intersections, signalization, additional vehicles to accommodate the demands of development, costs of fire protection and police services in the form of station equipment and vehicles to meet the demands of future service, costs arising from the municipality's transit optimization study that would provide for additional transit capacity for growth, and water and wastewater services in the form of additional supply, storage, and expansion to wastewater treatment capacity, again, to meet the demands of new development. In addition, we see the area-specific charges, which address the more localized needs of water and wastewater distribution and collection systems, improvements to bridges in localized areas, and creek stabilization and pond improvements for stormwater that benefit those subgeographies I referred to earlier. And so, in the detail of the background study, in Chapter 5, you'll see the capital needs identified for each of those services. In total, the capital program over that build-out horizon totals approximately $80 million. And when we look at the component of that, that is DC recoverable, as you can see, about 63% of those costs would be either funded by your existing reserve funds that have a current balance of about $5 million to support payments towards those, or the needed collection over that build-out period of an additional $50 million to accommodate those needs of service. And when we focus in on the $50 million that underlies the schedule of charges, what we see is that about 2/3 of those costs are for infrastructure related to water, wastewater, and storm. Another 26% related to roads, so approximately 8% of those pertain to the costs of fire, policing, and transit over those longer forecast periods. So with the anticipated costs and the development that we saw in the first step, that would produce an updated schedule of charges as you see presented here. Again, the scope of these is only for those hard services that we've mentioned. The charges are differentiated by built form in terms of residential and non-residential development, and within residential based on the types of units being constructed. And the difference in the types of residential units being constructed is reflective of the underlying occupancy that's exhibited in those units. So when we look at a single and semi-detached unit on urban services of water and wastewater, the DC payable would be $18,142. A similar unit being a bachelor or one-bedroom apartment would see a charge of approximately $6,500. Again, reflective of the occupancy exhibited in those units. The charges that would be imposed on all eligible industrial, commercial, and institutional types of development on a per square meter basis of floor area would be $74.57. So those are the broader municipal development charges. As I mentioned earlier, in addition to that, we're also maintaining the town's approach to have area-specific charges imposed on those subgeographies for the road, water, and wastewater works. And as you can see in the schedule of charges, they're imposed based on the developable land in terms of the hectarage that would be built. And so to put this in some comparison for council and the public, when we look at the charges today, a single detached unit today would pay $25,259 per unit. The updated calculated charges would see that decrease by about 4% to $24,287. As you'll note, by comparison, we've adjusted the hard services. The soft services would be maintained as per your 2014 bylaw and those current rates today through that transitionary period. With respect to the non-residential charges, again, the charges per square meter today at $95.50 would also decrease approximately by 4% to $91.90 per square meter. The area-specific charges, as we see again, are generally decreasing. Some are increasing based on the updated capital costs for the benefiting area, and also 2 additional projects that have been identified for creek stabilization projects and introduced through this bylaw as well. And so to put these development charges again in some broader comparison context for council and the public, as you can see, the area municipal town charges are also imposed in this jurisdiction, as well as upper tier charges by the county and by boards of education. The 4% reduction would see you keep your same relative positioning comparable to that imposed in areas of Shelburne, in Grand Valley, well below those documented in Caledon and other areas of the GTA. We see a similar comparison when we look at the charges for commercial development. What is notable in this regard is that by comparison to the residential charges, the municipalities of Amaranth and East Garifraxa fully exempt non-residential from the payment of development charges, adjusting their relative position. And similarly, when we look at industrial, what's also being proposed is that the municipality's exemption for industrial be maintained, so only the charges imposed by the county would be present on industrial development in the community going forward. And that policy is consistent with those we see reflected again in Amaranth, East Garifraxa, and also Grand Valley. So that's a summary of the needs and the comparison of those charges. The associated policies that you'll see governed in the, or identified for governance in the background study is largely being maintained, where the municipality would impose one development charge bylaw to continue to impose these charges, that they would be imposed at the time of building permit issuance, and that council could enter into separate agreements if they see fit to either defer or accelerate those payments with applicants. Also, the charges that are presented are denominated in current values today and would be indexed on the annual life of the bylaw to allow it to keep pace with capital cost inflation. The bylaw also recognizes that there are statutory exemptions that have to be followed under the Act, where development charges, if they were to be imposed on industrial, could not be imposed on an expansion if the only purpose of the expansion was to add up to 50% of the existing floor area. Also, development charges are not imposed on municipal facilities or boards of education. And finally, if there's a residential development that exists today, it can add additional dwelling units as permitted under the regulation, and they would have to be exempt from payment. The non-statutory exemptions, these are the ones that council has discretion over. And what's worth noting is the current exemptions that you have today are being maintained to fully exempt industrial, as well as cemeteries and places of worship. What has also been discussed with staff and being brought forward for council's consideration prior to adoption is the potential to add special care dwellings or long-term care facilities to the list of exempt developments. To provide some context for that, however, all of these exemptions, if council continues to provide for them, is foregoing DC revenues for that purpose. What you cannot do under the Act is to take the amounts of money that is being exempt and recover them by higher charges on other types of development. So for example, council could not exempt industrial, take the foregone revenue of industrial development, increase residential development charges to fund that. That would have to be a cost funded from a non-DC source, so your traditional mechanisms of taxation or water and wastewater rates. And so for council's consideration, just to provide some perspective with respect to special care dwellings or long-term care facilities, as they might be referred to, if you were exempting a long-term care development of approximately 120 units, the revenue of DCs that you would be foregoing based on the current proposed rates would be about $756,000. That would have to be made up from another source. It equates to approximately about 3% of the total DC recoverable cost under the 5-year bylaw. And then lastly, a notable policy as well is that sometimes development can occur through redevelopment activities where there's an existing house, for example, it may be demolished and replaced by a 6-unit townhouse as a result of redevelopment. Your bylaw, as do bylaws across the province, recognize this occurrence and provide credits for what is being demolished. Because if you're simply replacing a development with another, there's a vacated amount of service capacity that should be accounted for. So in that case, as long as the demolition had occurred within 2 years of the subsequent redevelopment, they would receive a credit equal to the single-family home rate that had been demolished, but they would pay the difference between that rate and the full DC on the new development. So in terms of next steps in the process then is for council to hear from the public in this matter, to give any consideration if there's any further amendments or refinements required to the background study or bylaw, and that background study would come forward to council with that bylaw on August the 26th for your consideration and adoption to allow you to impose those charges for the subsequent 5-year period.
Thank you, Mr. Grunder. Are there any questions from the public?
Yes, and so as we saw in this comparison here, so this is showing a comparison of those development charges for a single-family home, or a new single-family home being developed. As you can see, the charges here, including the lower tier, upper tier, and education charges would be just under $30,000 per unit. By comparison, in Caledon, those charges are about $90,000 a unit. And when you look at other areas of the GTA, the charges are much higher than that. Looking at some areas such as Markham, for example, being over $100,000 a unit.
Mr. Gristo, can you go to the microphone? We're unable to hear you on the TV.
I think I can speak loud enough for everybody.
We need to hear you on the TV.
You gotta hear me on TV, yeah? Anyway, I'm not gonna relay the question before. So do you feel that the town of Orangeville can improve on charging a lot more than what we've been charging in the past, compared to the numbers so that you specify?
So as I mentioned in the introduction, the charges the methodology in its determination is quite prescriptive. So it's not based on relative charges in other communities, but based specifically on the needs of the municipality and the expressions of council as to what infrastructure will be required to support development. So while they might be less than those in the GTA, they are reflective of the needs of this community to support development.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions from the public? Any questions from council? Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor McIntosh. Mr. Grunda, table 6-4 on page 6.5. This is the, I guess, the new schedule of DCs. And because there's a new column there, and it's the special care, special dwelling units column, which I don't think was on the previous DC rate card, if you want to call it that. Is that correct?
No, my understanding is that those charges are in place today, based on those types of dwelling units. When we did the work in 2014,
Okay.
We had looked at the treatment of those and treated them as types of residential dwellings.
So you mentioned long-term care facilities fit into that. And so the difference then between a standard apartment is, looks like 6502, and the special care unit's 6300, correct?
That's correct.
I'm just, like, we're in need of more long-term care beds here in Orangeville and all over, actually, Ontario. We're just wondering, is there ways to incentivize long-term care operators, whether they be private or public, to move ahead? And the reason I bring this up is because one of those operators came in to see me with their architect a couple of months ago, and they made the statement, and it made sense to me, that these rooms typically are 200, 250 square feet. There's no kitchen. There's a washroom facility in them. The residents of a long-term care facility aren't using the Parks and Recreation. They're not using the road system. They're not using the public transit system. I'm talking about strictly long-term care facilities. So why, is there a way that we can somehow alter that and give them more of a break, because they're not using actually the infrastructure services of a standard, a typical apartment dweller?
Yes, and so what is being reflected in the schedule of charges is that they do have a lower exhibited occupancy in those units than we would commonly see in an apartment, for example, and the charge is reflective of that. As I mentioned in the presentation, what council has available to you is, this is a recommended charge. Council can impose up to that amount. So as we illustrated in the presentation, council could fully exempt them from payment. If council wanted to, council could elect to partially exempt them. So for example, you could look at the schedule of charges, for example, and say that you would want to impose half of the charge. Or for example, saying we would want to maintain funding towards the water and wastewater infrastructure, but we would exempt the other service components from being
Right.
imposed, for example.
I think that's what I'm getting at, fellow council members, so we'll have to look at that going forward, because we want to encourage these long-term care beds to be built, and if they're not, if the typical resident's not using the infrastructure that a typical resident would be using, then I think it's fair that we could reduce that charge. Thank you.
Councillor Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's along the same lines of the long-term care facilities or the special care homes. Can you comment or give some insight on other municipalities that may have taken that action, and to what degree? Just some examples for us.
Yes, so in developing these charges, the primary consideration for most councils is if they should be treated as an institutional development or if they should be treated as a residential development. And the approach here, which is building on the approach in 2014, is to treat them as residential, but to recognize that they have a lower occupancy than other types of units. And so that approach is becoming much more common that we're seeing in municipalities, is to treat them in the manner that's being proposed here for council today.
Sorry, do you have an example or two?
Yeah, so if we look at, for example, the municipalities that are present on this table, for example, Caledon would treat them as such. Also, when we look at proposals in other municipalities, I believe Center Wellington also treats them in that manner. In Grand Valley, I believe they would treat them similarly as well in that respect. A number of the other municipalities would continue to treat them principally as institutional. But in the larger GTA municipalities, we definitely see that trend moving towards treating them as residential and having this lower occupancy of about 1.1 persons per unit.
Mayor Brown.
Sorry, back to the same line of questioning. I just did the math here on your special care DC versus an apartment DC, 6,300 versus 6,502. So basically, the special care unit is at a 97% of the other apartments. So I don't see that reflects occupancy, nor does it reflect use of town facilities. So I just wanted to point that out to councilors so that we maybe can think about this going forward, that a difference of only 3% doesn't seem reasonable to me for those types of facilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Brown. Seeing no other questions, this public meeting is closed. Council will take no action on this matter tonight. Staff will be reporting at a later date with a recommendation for council resolution.
There is someone in the audience that has put their hand up.
Okay. Go ahead, sir.
You have to come up to the mic, please. Yeah.
I honestly, it felt like the right time to come here tonight.
Excuse me, could we have your name and address?
I'm Wayne Patterson. I live at 116 Parkinson Crescent in Orangeville. Can you hear me now?
Excuse me, is this for question period?
Yes.
Okay, we haven't got to that yet.
Oh, I thought this was ending
No,
council. I apologize. I got here late and I didn't know where we were at.
no problem. We'll make sure we look you up when it's time. Thank you.
Sorry. There's actually a second presentation that he needs to make as part of this DC review, correct,
Okay.
Nandini?
Well, we'll play musical chairs one more time. Thank you.
And so, sorry, this one will be brief. This is more of a technicality because the first presentation is pertaining to the portion of the background study that's looking at introducing the new charges under this 2019 bylaw. What we also need to do is amend the 2014 bylaw to remove those services, and this will allow you to continue to impose the soft services for parks, recreation, and library until you transition under the community benefits charge in 2020. So just to highlight that, again, as we've mentioned, the background study summarizes this proposal, both in the form of the 2019 bylaw and the 2014 bylaw. And so what is also being proposed in that background study is an amendment to bylaw 70/2014 to remove the hard services and allow you to transition those soft services. Other than that amendment, no other changes are being proposed to the 2014 bylaw. And so what you see identified here is the charges for municipal parking, parks and recreation, and library, which is referred to as the soft services under Bill 108. The indexed rates that you see at the bottom are the rates that are currently imposed today, and those would continue on over the course of 2020 until council moves through the transitionary period of removing these, replacing this bylaw with a community benefits charge bylaw. And so that's just to summarize again, it'll come through the same process, and that amending bylaw will come forward to council on August 26th to facilitate that.
Thank you, Mr. Grundy. Any questions from the public on this? Go ahead, ma'am. Come up to the microphone, please.
Thank you for your presentation. I didn't understand most of it, but I tried to read the document. So first of all, on 4/4 of page 163 regarding water, I was wondering, there's three parts of the water. One is water service, I think, and the other one's water treatment. And another one doesn't seem to, the development charge doesn't apply to local water services. Could you elaborate on that for me?
Could I just get your name, please, for the record?
I'm sorry, Susan Sherman.
Thank you.
Sure. So what that's identifying is that when development occurs, it has a need for demand of water services. There are certain portions of those costs of new development that will be paid for directly by a developer.
Right.
So when a developer has a plan of subdivision, they will have to construct their own internal water works, right? And because they're paying for them directly by constructing them, those costs would also not be in a DC for recovery because the municipality would be recovering it twice.
Oh, okay.
Right, so the costs outside of the subdivision for additional treatment capacity, for additional storage, for example, would be costs that would be included in the DC because it services more than just that specific development, and they all share towards payment of that through the DC.
Okay, that's very helpful. I have another question. It's regarding the soft services, and I'd like to know regarding the community benefit part. If I understand that correctly, there's a land value that is somehow calculated, a formula, and then that money has to be used within 1 year. Is that correct? And how does that affect the operation of a town that has 2 recreation centers and high property taxes?
So again, so maybe to provide some background. So as you see in the 2014 bylaw, soft services like recreation were eligible to be included in a DC bylaw, right? And they would have been imposed for new facilities that would be required for growth, right? And they would be imposed at the time of the issuance of a building permit, depending on the nature of that permit. So if it was a single family home, they would pay a charge for recreation that would go towards that new facility. What the province is doing now is it's saying we're no longer going to allow that to be included in a DC bylaw.
Why?
Because they've identified through their housing action plan that they want to have it funded more transparently and differently through something called a community benefits charge, right?
Why have they done that?
So in part, there's the housing action plan identifies that there's affordability concerns with new housing.
Right.
And there's a number of tenants that they had identified through their research that they think are impacting housing affordability, one of them being fees and charges that are being imposed by municipalities. So in part, what they're doing is looking to adjust some of those fees and charges and to provide for greater transparency in how those charges are being imposed.
Okay, okay. That's very helpful. Thank you.
No problem.
On the spot. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there any other questions from the public? Mr. Garisto, please go to the microphone.
Follow-up question on the same topic is, did I understand you correct that the municipality cannot take 5% for parkland? Is that the way we're going with this? Because my understanding from before that we able to get 5% for parkland. So in other words, if you get 100 acres to develop, the municipality is entitled to 5 acres of the land. Is that the case that I hear?
So what is being proposed is that previously you had soft services being funded through DCs. You also had, under the provisions of the Planning Act, either the ability to require dedicated lands for park purposes or cash in lieu of parks if you weren't going to take land. What is being proposed under the community benefits charge regime is that now the soft services that previously were eligible to be funded under a DC, as well as the needs for additional parkland, will be encompassed under this community benefits regime. And so the cost of the soft services as well as additional parkland will have to be funded through that mechanism. And the way it'll be imposed is that instead of it being imposed based on the built form at the time of building permit issuance, it'll be paid for based on the value of the land. So for example, it may be 5% of land value that would be imposed at the time of building permit issuance, and that revenue would go to support the acquisition of parkland as well as the other soft services that were formerly eligible under the DC.
So in other words, the province is scrapping the 5%. Is that what you're telling me?
It's modifying it. It's building it into this broader community benefit strategy.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Any other questions from the public? Seeing none, any questions from council? Seeing none, the meeting's closed.
Okay. So that concludes our statutory public meetings for tonight. Moving on to item 8, which are presentations, petitions, or delegations. Our first delegation, 8.1, is Mr. Chuck Tebow from Central Counties Tourism. Mr. Tebow.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Chuck. I am the Executive Director of Central Counties Tourism. We're the provincially funded not-for-profit that's dedicated to developing, supporting, and promoting tourism for all of Durham region, all of York region, and right here in the Headwaters tourism region. And now that you've got 8 months under your belt, or so, 3/4 of a year, I thought it would be a good opportunity to come and talk about the importance of tourism to communities from an economic development standpoint, from a resident standpoint, and just spend a couple of minutes bending your ears. I think the first thing we should probably be doing is define what a tourist is. Because when you think tourist, you think of someone who looks like me, who's wearing a Hawaiian shirt and a Tilly hat and Birkenstocks with socks and some cargo pants and maybe some zinc on his nose. And the fact of the matter is, when we think about tourism in this region specifically, that's not typically what you're getting. You are getting a bunch of day trippers coming out of Toronto. You're getting people coming up here for sporting events like I did 2 Sundays ago. Your Northman lacrosse team had a little tournament for the Pee-wees, and my son was here for 3 games, and I calculated it. So my family, we spent just over $150, almost $160 in your town on that day. When you think about really what tourism is, it's about people who don't live here and who don't work here, who are spending their hard-earned disposable income with you. And that has a great benefit to the community. This is the macro look, and I know it's tough to fathom all these numbers, but really in Headwaters, and this is going back, I think the StatsCan is always behind in their data, and this is from 2016. But we were able to calculate, or StatsCan was able to calculate, that they had just over 2 million visitors here, spending $225 million at the thousands of tourism businesses in your region that employ tens of thousands of tax-paying residents. And really, tourism does have that trickle effect. As we went and got our free dilly bars at Dairy Queen on Sunday, the place was packed. It was packed because they staffed up, and they staffed up because they knew they gave 4 teams of 17 kids per team free dilly bars. And as someone who went in there, you now know that those kids are getting employed. They're spending their money at, at the movie theaters and buying clothes and all that kind of stuff right here in town. When they do that, that means that there's more staff and there's more groceries being bought and that sort of thing. So it really does have a great trip. For every dollar spent, you're getting it more and more. Enhancing tourism in your community, really, it helps attract new business. Success begets success. If you are coming in to the Blues and Jazz Fest that takes place here every year, probably the biggest event in this region every year, and you are a business owner looking to move, and you see a vibrant community, this could be somewhere that you take a look at moving to. It attracts new residents. In Uxbridge, they brought in Thomas the Tank Engine. So a family event, and they had the big Thomas the Tank Engine at the front of the train. And I talked to the volunteers afterwards, and they said, I got the weirdest question every day. Where's the nearest real estate office? Because they'd never been to Uxbridge. No one wakes up in the morning and says, man, I'm in Windsor, and says, I'm going to Uxbridge, right? They're going to wake up, and they're going to see what there is to see and do, and they're going to buy a ticket, and they're going to go, and they go, holy crap, this place is fantastic. Let's go, and let's live there. It retains and grows your current business. And this is something, it's when you're in a smaller community, you've got your beautiful downtown, you've got your favorite coffee shop. And your favorite coffee shop is open in the middle of January during that snowstorm when you want your coffee the absolute most, and it's open for you. And sometimes it's open because all through the summer they had an extra 10 or 12 people per day that weren't from here, that helped pay the bills, that allowed them to stay open year-round. And it just makes it become a vibrant place to live, work, and visit. And Orangeville gets it. You guys all get it. You guys have some phenomenal events. You have, in my mind, the Blues and Jazz Fest has become a community event. Everyone is participating. Everyone is benefiting. The fact that Dairy Queen partnered with the Northmen and understood the value of giving away a free dilly bar, which then cost me an extra $23 in blizzards, right? They got it. They get it. You've got phenomenal partnerships taking place between your theater and Island Lake and the hotel to drive overnight visitation, doing all these great things. That is bringing new money into the community, and every time you do that, it is good for business. This is just a chart that talks about tourism is only as strong as the assets. I don't own anything, right? I'm Central Counties. So really, it's the municipal tourism businesses and the public assets of Orangeville, that's what drives tourism into this place. It's then supported by the fantastic staff you have at the BIA and right here for the town of Orangeville. And it trickles up to Headwaters Tourism, who takes what you're doing and promotes it through the region and as far as they can. Central Counties then helps take your best stories and helps develop those stories to tell them on a provincial and a national scale, and then it goes up through the Ministry of Tourism and Destination Ontario and Destination Canada. It's a reverse funnel. It's all about the assets on the ground. It's about your small businesses. It's about Island Lake. It's about your downtown core and the history behind it. And then we try to channel that and laser point it to the right people. This is the main slide. There's a lot of resources that council and staff can take advantage of. So Headwaters Tourism does a great job. They've got their municipal page on their tourism website. You've got your events calendar, the visitor's guide. Central Counties Tourism, we're here to help. We do community tourism planning. So if you want an action plan, an actionable plan of what tourism could be here based on what the people in the room want. Because I don't know what tourism success looks like for Orangeville. It's the people in Orangeville that are going to facilitate. I'll just facilitate it. They'll tell us, and we'll have a fantastic tourism plan with a 1, 2, and 3 year action plan that I guarantee, as long as Central Counties exists, we won't let collect dust. That's the key. So we've done this for 8 or 9 different communities. Some of them are now on their refreshes. We do wayfinding planning, and it's because of Orangeville that we do wayfinding planning. Orangeville was the first person to come up to us and say, Chuck, we want to do a wayfinding plan. Can you help us? And we said, yeah, that'd be great, as long as I can sit in the meetings and learn how it's done. So we've been implementing with you year after year, and we've got some money to partner with you. But I've been able to take what I learned in the process, and now I go and do wayfinding for other municipalities at a fraction of the cost, and I appreciate that. We do municipal websites, and then together we do stuff for sports tourism bidding. So when you want to really expand, you guys had what's the big lacrosse tournament? You had it here a couple years ago, and everyone was showing up, and your town was jammed with lacrosse players. We do leverage marketing, we do familiarization tours. So when you've got great stories to tell, like your downtown core and Fromage, which is really, really active and doing some really cool stuff with our Temperance and Temptation program, we're going to send people to help tell that story to people who want to hear it and want to be motivated to travel because of it. We do some product development, we do leverage tourist investment, and we help with reporting because numbers are really important. So every time we work with your stakeholders, we ask them for their numbers so we can come back and you can come back and talk about the importance from an economic standpoint, from a business standpoint, and from a residential standpoint. And I think my 5 minutes is up. The last thing I just want to leave you with is tourism spending, it's an investment, not an expense. For every dollar you're spending, you're going to be getting 5 or 6 in return. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Your Worship, to Mr. Thibault. Thank you very much, first of all, for being here. Know a lot about central tourism, and through my role in Councillor Post, we both have portfolios that are kind of associated through BDAC, which is the Business Economic Development, and of course, Councillor Post with culture. I absolutely agree the importance of tourism. My curiosity, just a little humor here, was it burgers, fries, or chicken strips?
For lunch?
Just
No,
DQ, sorry.
No. You know what? We actually were very smart, and we went to the grocery store.
Good.
And
Glad
we
you
picked
supported
up
our
a
other
whole
businesses.
bunch of junk food instead of going out to the fast food places.
But more specific, I think that the support that you can provide to our tourism department, also with Ms. Phillips, who happens to be in the gallery here. She's really been instrumental in moving some things forward. Of course, the leadership with Mr. Osman as well. Again, I look at the economic benefit, and I think the economic benefit to our community is absolutely imperative. And I'm, like many of us, we're all champions, and we want to see opportunities that arise. And I think any suggestions that you ended up highlighting in some of the slides are going to be very helpful to benefit us in the years to come. I know that Councillor Taylor's talked about his passion of hockey, as I have, and I also look at lacrosse too as well. That's just tipping, the piece of the iceberg. I think that there's much more happening here. We have, some other new events that can also help to attract, and certainly get in touch with Councillor Post about the You're Awesome event, which really was awesome, as well as other events that we have here. So I think that getting an inventory of things that we're already doing that you may not be aware of, but also at the same time reciprocating that can be very helpful departmentally.
Thank you for pointing that out. And we work very, very, very closely with Ruth, and she lets us know what's going on, make sure that the events pages are done up, and where there's those great fits. Well, actually, we just worked with Ruth, and we redid a whole ton of photography in town, and it was something that helps us because and helps the town. Like, we needed the photography because we wanted to have these beautiful pictures. Like, every picture in the slide deck, that's Orangeville. Like, we didn't use stock photography. We used Orangeville because we had it. Because Ruth said, Chuck, we got to get some photos. We said, okay, we can do that. So we firmly believe in partnership, because what helps you helps us.
Great. Well, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Your Worship. I always hate going after Councillor Andrews because he's so eloquent, and I just don't have the same abilities that he. Yes, it's very good. I guess, thank you very much for your presentation, for being here today. My question, I guess, would be around, you mentioned that Central Counties tells the story and then you laser point at the right people. I assume that Ruth has been involved in this. She's all over it, and we're fortunate to have her in Orangeville. But, you know, that's of great interest to me. How would you do that? So maybe I'll ask the question, and then if I could come back, Your Worship, which is one other thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we purchased basically a software program through Environics that tells you exactly who people are based on postal codes. And when we have events in town and we have our partners throughout town, we ask them to collect postal codes. And it's fantastic information, because once you get a postal code and you get 500 of them, you run a report, and it tells, you know, the exact types of people who are coming to either a festival or to a certain business, where they're coming from, what their media habits are, what's the household makeup, what else they like to do. Because if you're thinking and you go, wow, this person likes blues and jazz, but they also like farmers markets, you know, you can say, why aren't we working with the farmers market and doing something together to drive more? It basically tells all of these different things and does a distance decay and shows you sort of, you know, where's your best bet, and tells you where pockets of those people live that you haven't reached yet. So just say you're getting a bunch of people coming out of you know, northwest Mississauga, because it's a certain demographic of people who love to do what you do. This thing also tells you, did you know that there's the same pocket of people that are in Southern Barrie? And if you just focus in on those, and of course with all social media now, you can target right down to the postal code, and it all goes back and forth. If you ever want to try it out, I just did it today because I was writing something up. If you go to environics.ca on your mobile, you can download the app and you type in your postal code and it tells you who you are. And it's a little creepy, but it works. So that's where we get the most of our information from. So information is key. We did. In Port Perry, they did a patio project, and it was very contentious, terribly contentious, and people didn't want to take a parking spot, you know, for a patio on their historic downtown. But finally, it got pushed through with a caveat that they had to collect postal code data. And as it turns out, more than 60% of the people sitting on those patios last summer were not from Port Perry, and 30% of them weren't from Durham. And this year it expanded because they had the data, and the data showed the economic impact of what was going on. And those same types of people who were sitting on the patio were the same types of people who were visiting the brewery and visiting the restaurants, or the other restaurants, and visiting the shops.
I think that's exactly spot on in terms of what we need to do. And, you know, this council knows that we have a bunch of different cultural events coming up. And Chuck, I know you just spent $160 here. I'm trying to piece it through just like Councillor Andrews did. You had $23 at Dairy Queen. I'm sure they appreciated it. Be interesting to understand where the other 140 went. But here's some suggestions for you and for everybody else in town. We have, and it's gratuitous, Your Worship, but Rotary Rib Fest is coming up this weekend. I would encourage you, Chuck, to come back and bring your family to that. It's Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Admission is free. And then if you came back to Orangeville at the end of the month, you could go out to Island Lake and you could watch Theatre Orangeville's Matilda. And that is on the 27th, 28th. And our local group of singers called the Sweet Adelines will be there. So these are all things you should bring your family to.
To come up here very often because Halton Hills and Northman don't see eye to eye. I believe, and I'm just going to look at Emily here, that all of those events are already up on our site. So we are already promoting all of those. So Emily, who's going to stand up just for a second, she's our field rep for Headwaters, and she works daily and weekly with Ruth and with all of your stakeholders in town to find out what they're doing, and starts to piece those pieces together. And we create these really cool itineraries and routes and tell these great thematic stories based on what's happening, and push people into the area through those stories.
That's great. Thank you.
Councillor Sherwood.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. Through you, I'm going to follow Mr. Councillor Taylor's footsteps here, and I'm going to do a little bit of promoting as well with our downtown, our business improvement area. I would assume that you have connected with them for providing events that are happening there. What I would like to mention is that we have the most beautiful downtown in all of Ontario. There's no doubt about it. But we are really promoting the Sunday shopping. Most of the merchants are opening up and being more perceptive to being open longer. So in having to complement that, we have recruited buskers and crafters to come downtown at certain areas on a Sunday to bring people down to walk our beautiful downtown and take advantage of seeing some of our entertainers or buskers. And hopefully that's something you're able to promote on your site as well.
First of all, let me congratulate you on that initiative. I've, BIAs throughout our region. It's a tough slog. So the fact that you've done that's a newsworthy story. On top of the commercial, trying to get the consumers to come in, that's a newsworthy story. That is something that, now that I know that, we will work towards telling that from a B2B perspective as well, because that's a huge success. And from a consumer standpoint, if you've got a BIA that understands that they need to be open when people aren't working, that's phenomenal, and we will help promote that, because people are they're looking for places to go on the weekends. And
thank you. I just want to share an example with a really good news story. Actually, a group of 4 young gentlemen came and did an entertainment in front of one of our newly opened smokehouses, and according to that business owner, they did a live Facebook of these entertainers in front of that drew in an astronomical amount of business into that as soon as those entertainers were out in front of the street.
Very good. Thank you, Councillor Taylor, or Sherwood. Any further comments or questions? Chuck, thank you so much for coming. We appreciate all that you do for us and working with Ruth and the others in our Economic Development Department and Headwaters Tourism, so thank you so much.
We appreciate all the work that you guys are doing, and just give us a call when you need us.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, moving along. We had a delegation from Welcome Wagon. Unfortunately, they're not able to join us tonight. So we're going to move on to delegation 8.3. Susan Sherman wants to talk about water rate increases. Susan.
Hello, good evening. I'm here to raise a concern regarding water rates. They seem high, at least when I get my bill, particularly distribution. The combination of water and high property taxes makes living unaffordable. We haven't even put food or included other necessities. I am asking that Council considers comparing rates to other municipalities to verify where we rank. Furthermore, if water reduction has occurred, these savings should be passed on to the public to further incentivize good conservation behavior. It might be an idea to look at annual water rates even prior to the last municipal government, which might give a clearer, more sweeping overview of water rates. This might have been overlooked due to certain dynamics. Orangeville did at one point have a water committee. It might be advisable to restore it. There is an awareness of the importance of water safety, but also water is a necessity for all people. High water rates, like high property taxes, can create greater divide and polarization, and can be a disadvantage for low-income people or the increasing number of people who have temporary and contractual work. This is probably early for budget considerations, but let's be honest. Orangeville has high property tax rates. Using the Occam's razor principle, water rates might have followed suit. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Any comments from Council? Thank you, Ms. Sherman, for your presentation there and your suggestion. Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think the resident brings up a good point, and I wonder if it would just be incumbent upon us to ask Mr. Jones for his opinion on the matter.
Mr. Jones.
Certainly, through you, Your Worship, to Councillor Taylor. Until 2003, the town of Orangeville collected water rates on a flat rate. We did not meter our water. In 2003, we began universal water metering, and you'll recall that were a few short years following the Walkerton tragedy. The rules surrounding the provision of municipal drinking water changed significantly following the Walkerton tragedy, as did the costs associated with providing those services. When we entered into our first water and wastewater rates bylaw to set the rates, there was new legislation put out by the province that talked about the way in which water rates ought to be calculated and what water rates would be eligible to fund. Essentially, we collect water rates to provide water. We collect wastewater rates to treat wastewater. And we can't use those monies for tax purposes, nor can we use taxes to fund water or wastewater services. What was determined back in 2002 when we were setting the rates for 2003 was that we had been historically under-collecting what we needed to in order to provide for the operation of the water and wastewater utilities, but also the foreseeable capital requirements as well as long-term life cycle costs. And the council of the day was given the option of essentially tripling the amount people were paying for water overnight, or slowly but surely increasing what people had to pay until such time as we were collecting sufficient monies to cover off the operating capital and life cycle costs associated with providing water and wastewater services. For some years, the increases were in the order of 7, 8, 9% per year. I'm pleased to say that in 2015, that dropped down to less than 4, in 2016, less than 3, and it has been in the order of 2, 2.5% for the last several years. Essentially, the approach that the council took back in 2002 has paid off, and we have now caught up with what we need to fund our water and wastewater services. For some years, the increases were significantly in excess of inflation. However, now that we've caught up, I would expect that we will maintain them at or around the level of inflation. But as council is aware, we need to update our water and wastewater rates bylaw, and staff will be coming forward with information prior to the end of 2019, asking council to pass a new slate of rates for the next 5 years, and hopefully that those increases will be, as I say, in or around the rate of inflation.
Great. Just a follow-up to Councillor Taylor's question, and to what Ms. Sherman mentioned was, can we, in that rate study, get some comparisons with other municipalities? And is that part of your standard costing?
Your Worship, yes, it is something we can do, and it is part of our standard costing. And generally, my recollection, and of course you will see it in the next few months, my recollection is that with the exception of the region of Peel, whose rates are quite low, Orangeville's rates are not dissimilar to most municipalities.
Right. Anybody else? Okay, thank you. Moving along, 8.4, Mr. Gristo.
Your Worship, Deputy Mayor, Member of Council, staff, members of the gallery, good evening. I'll make it fairly swift here tonight. I was here a couple of weeks ago, and a motion was moved by yourself, Mr. Mayor, and second by the Deputy Mayor, to send my request over the Bocce ball court for the next recreation master plan. I want to remind you that it's already there. It's already into the master plan, sir. And Apparently, it's under the Orangeville Parks Master Plan, which was finalized July 2015. And on paragraph 4, I will only read you the one where it says, consider new types of facilities such as pickleball courts, bocce courts, lawn bowling greens, cricket pitches, but I don't want to bore you with the rest. So I understand that the motion was to send it back to that, but it's already there. So what I'm requesting from you tonight, Mr. Mayor and member of the council, I'm requesting for a motion of a reconsideration of the motion. As I stated at the last meeting, I already have the parties that are willing to build these bocce courts at no cost to the town. So what are we waiting for? So what I need from this council, a motion to reconsider and a motion to authorize the staff to work with myself and work with those bodies that are willing to build it at no cost to the town. And let's make it happen. It's another piece of recreation in our town, and it's beneficial for everyone, families, young adults, seniors. It's also, you were talking about tourism, the gentleman that brought you that. That's another piece that could bring you tourism. Because if you get a good team in here, who's gonna stop that team to invite the other teams from other areas to come in here so they can play, and then you declare whoever becomes the champion. It could be Kitchener, it could be Orangeville, it could be whoever. So my point is, let's not waste any more time. The three people, like I said, was Achone Construction and Greenwood and Doug Harkness from Precast. They were a little bit disappointed. The council did not give it a go-ahead to proceed. So I would ask you again tonight, please pass the motion, authorize staff to work with myself and work with those donors, and let's make it happen. Thank you.
Okay, comments from councilors? Mr. Taylor.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship, and thank you, Mr. Gristo, for your presentation. To me, this was brought forward to council 2 or 3 weeks ago. Council made a decision. I stand by that decision. We have a process in place. We have asked staff to do a report on what recreation should be, and to that end, I make a motion that we receive this report and simply move on. Thank you.
Right. Just to add to that, Mr. Gristo, we appreciate your passion, and I'm not suggesting that this isn't going to happen, but we have a process here that we want to go through. Mr. Osmond's overseeing a review, consultants being hired. There's a lot of different recreational assets that we have and projects that we're going to look at. And, you know, although you mentioned something in 2015, the last council obviously didn't move forward with spending that money or implementing that. So I think this council, we're looking at fiscal management, we're looking at the right spend of money for everything, and we want to see a needs analysis for a bocce ball court, and that's basically what our feeling is. As much as it's fun to play bocce, and I'm not suggesting it's not going to happen, but to push it through right now, I don't think we have an appetite for that. So I'm going to second Mr. Councillor Taylor's motion. Any further comment here? I'm going to call a vote. We don't need a vote.
Center. I want to remind you, sir, the motion that Mr. Taylor is putting to the floor tonight is nonsense. Okay. Totally nonsense.
Okay. Okay.
Because it's right here.
Mr.
This is
Gristo.
your master plan that was done and finalized by the previous council, sir. So you're paying a consultant now to give you another master plan. I want to remind you, sir, that we did the master plan without the consultant in play. We did it ourselves.
Thank you.
I see that this council, it seems to go behind the consultant after consultant. And here it is. It doesn't cost you any money. So why would you deny? Because it's Nick Agristo? It's because it's Nick Agristo here that is asking you to proceed with this, sir? So I find it very disrespectful, actually, if you ask me. I
find it very disrespectful that you've come
Just
back
a
to
minute.
us tonight.
If the other member
So,
council follows
can you
suit
cut
to
his mic,
support your
please?
motion, sir.
Madam Clerk, Mr. Gristo, we're not recording a vote, no. We dealt with your issue last council meeting. We were kind to give you another delegation to talk about it. There's no appetite here to change what happened. So thank you for your time today. All the best. We're not voting on anything. Thank you. Would you please leave? Thank you. Would you please leave, sir? Yes, please leave. We're done with your item. We're done with your item, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. All the best. Okay, moving on. 8.5, we have Murray Short here from RLB Chartered Professional Accountants. Going to be talking about consolidated financial statements for the year 2018. Mr. Short.
Thanks. Thank you, Your Worship, members of council. Appreciate the opportunity to present the draft financial statements for the year ended December 31st, 2018. I'll just make a few general comments before I get into the financial statements. And we also have some graphs that are part of your package beginning at page number 220. The audited financial statements are in draft until council sees fit to approve them, which we would anticipate to be happening at this meeting. Should there be anything that arises that means that that decision is deferred, then we would obviously need approval at a subsequent meeting, and our financial statements we've finalized as of that date. As council may recall, your firm went through an RFP process this year to appoint your auditors for a coming term. So our firm was appointed as of April the 29th. Of 2019 for the 2018 fiscal year-end audit. We started the audit on April 30th, so the day after our appointment, we were in here starting our audit, and it's our intent, and certainly the intent of the finance department staff and staff to across the town overall, for us to be presenting at a sooner date than July the 15th. Obviously, we're kind of more than 6 months after your year-end, and it would be our intent and the intent of staff as well to be in much sooner. Because of the timeline of our appointments, we're a little later than we'd like to be presenting these draft financial statements. I do want to thank the finance department staff for their work. Obviously, there's been some new staff coming in. Nandini herself very recently hired as your director of finance, and some turnover in terms of some of the staffing of the finance department. But nonetheless, we were able to kind of get through our audit process in relatively short order. And the books were well maintained, and we certainly do appreciate the diligence of staff in assisting us through the process. As new auditors to the town, it's a learning curve for us to understand processes here, internal controls, and all those sorts of things that we need to look at as part of the audit process. And we were able to do so and get up to speed and get through the audit process in relatively short order, all things considered. So we do appreciate that. I will point out, again, before getting to the statements themselves, These statements are presented based on Canadian public sector accounting standards. Those are going to differ somewhat from what you will have seen over the course of the year in terms of your financial statement presentation as well as your budgeting. Most municipalities budget on a cash basis. You budget based on kind of the amount of money that you need to use for capital projects and operating activities over the course of the year. Pulling some of that money from tax revenue, from development charges, from gas tax revenues, and all those sorts of things. But basically, recording on a cash basis. These financial statements are presented based on kind of a modified accrual accounting basis. And so there are going to be some differences, and some of the numbers are going to look fairly unfamiliar. So when we get to things like your surplus for the year, I'll point out that that will look fairly different from what you will have seen over the course of the year in terms of your regular interim reporting throughout the course of the year. So with that said, then I'll get into the financial statements themselves. As I said, we will have some graphs that give a bit more context to the financial statements as well, and so we like to present those when we're presenting municipal financial statements, because the numbers themselves and just the volume of the financial statements themselves is quite overwhelming, or can be, certainly when your financial statements are 30 plus pages long. So the audit report itself is on pages just have to scroll, I guess. 3 to 4 of our financial statements in your package, pages 185 and 186. I won't read through it in detail. I will point out the opinion paragraph is at the top. The format's changed a little bit from audit reports you would have seen in the past. The opinion paragraph has moved from the bottom to the top of the financial statements. And you can see the opinion in the second paragraph saying that our conclusion is that these financial statements are presented fairly in accordance with Canadian public sector accounting standards. That's what you're looking for from us as your auditors. Basically, it's a clean audit opinion on the financial statements. There is a bit of detail on the basis of our opinion, the fact that you had a predecessor auditor. Again, we're a first-year auditor, so we need to disclose that there was a previous auditor that did the audit for the 2017 financial statements, the numbers of which are included in these financial statements. And then there's some information on the responsibilities of management and those charged with governance, which ultimately is council. And at the end of the report, a bit of information on our responsibility as your auditors. I will point out that there is a link to our website. This is a new inclusion in audit reports. Some firms have decided to take that option to include a link. Other firms have elected to include the whole amount in the audit report. We've chosen to add the link because otherwise our audit report would carry on to a third page and make the financial statements even lengthier. And we decided that it was simpler to do that and allow people to read, go to our website and read that additional information should they choose to do so. So page 187 of your package is the statement of financial position. I won't go through every line. I will just point out some highlights. If you take in total the first 3 lines of financial assets, that being cash, restricted cash, and temporary investments, the total of those 3 lines in the 2017 year was $43.4 million. That increased to $46.8 million in the 2018 year. That's a combination of an increase, a general surplus for the organization, as well as an increase in your reserves and reserve funds. And we'll talk about that when we get to subsequent statements. But the organization has seen growth in those reserves and reserve funds in particular from 2017 to 2018, and in fact from previous years as well. Down below those 3 lines of financial assets, we have some receivables. Taxes receivable is up somewhat, about $600,000. It's still well within what we would consider to be a reasonable range, though, for a municipality of your size. When we get to the graphs, I'll highlight that. But a $2.6 million taxes receivable for your tax base is not, from our standpoint, a concern whatsoever. You do have other receivables, as do all municipalities. That's a combination of grants receivable, water and sewer rates, HST rebates, and all those sorts of things. And you can see that balance is also up to the tune of about $1 million. We expect to see some variability in that receivable. It's not a question of collections. In particular, you had grants that were higher, outstanding grants at the end of the year that were higher by about $1 million or $1.1 million this year versus last. And that's just a timing of when grants are received, as well as the grants that you're actually allocated by the other levels of government in the province or federally. And then the last financial asset is your investment in government business enterprises. That's primarily your investment in Orangeville Hydro. We have a note to show that balance and what that's comprised of, and some disclosures that are required around that. But as you do own the vast majority of that business or that organization, you have a significant investment, and that's included in that line. Down below the financial assets, we have liabilities, a promissory note, as well as some long-term debt. You can see the long-term debt's been paid down fairly significantly in the year. Again, the debt position for the municipality isn't a concern from our standpoint. It's well in line with what we would expect to see for municipalities of your size. There's accounts payable. You can see that balance is down. That's just due to timing of payments going out the door, as well as capital projects. I think our understanding is you had a fair amount more outstanding in capital projects at the end of the year in 2017 versus 2018. Deferred revenue is primarily obligatory reserve funds. So those are reserve funds required through legislation, gas tax agreements, includes your development charges. And you can see that that balance is up. There is a note that breaks that out, but that balance is up by about $800,000. Then there's some post-employment and landfill post-closure liabilities. Those are just expected future costs for retiring employees, as well as closing the landfill site and the ongoing maintenance and required monitoring for the landfill site. And down at the bottom, we have the non-financial assets, primarily your tangible capital assets, roads, buildings, infrastructure, all those sorts of things. And you can see that balance has increased fairly substantially. And quite frankly, the town's investment in its infrastructure over the past several years has been strong. And again, I'll highlight that in the graphs when we come to them. So the net of all of that is your accumulated surplus. You can see that balance is up to $215,000. There is a separate schedule that breaks that out. Most of that is your investment in tangible capital assets, but that balance is up by $13 million and change, which is your surplus in the year overall. But that includes, again, your increase in reserves and reserve funds and those sorts of things. So that's a number that won't sound as familiar to you, but the $13.3 million is what we're showing as the surplus on the year, primarily because of growth in reserves and reserve funds in particular. Page 188 of your package is the statement of operations. This shows the revenues and expenditures for the town for the year. And with comparatives from the prior year, you can see in total revenues are very comparable, $64.2 million versus $64.1 the year before. You can see increases, as we would expect to see on your tax revenue, both a combination of increased assessment, as well as supplemental taxes and those sort of things, driving up your taxation revenue. Fees and user charges also up by a comparable amount, about 5-6% in each case. Grants up as well. And grants, again, we would expect to see some variability in grants depending on the grant programs that you apply to and are accepted for, and the funds that you do spend. Because if you don't spend the grants you get, then they get deferred to future years. Other income is down fairly substantially. That's because in 2018 you assumed some new capital assets as part of development agreements and those sorts of things. And we have a note that shows that. And then there's the income from Orangeville Hydro. I will point out here, the budget number is budgeted based on the cash you expect to receive in terms of dividends. The actual revenue is a combination of those dividends plus the increase because of your share of the net income, which wouldn't necessarily all be paid out in dividends. And that's why that number is higher than you would have budgeted, and you wouldn't expect to see that $1 million because you're not receiving that all in cash, but you're receiving that as part of the equity pickup from your investment in Orangeville Hydro. Down below we have expenditures, and you can see that those in total are up by about $500,000 to $50.9 from $50.4 million. Primarily the reason for the changes is in materials lines across protection and environmental services. A bit of an increase on the general government side on materials as well. That can vary pretty significantly, particularly on the transportation environmental services line. Transportation, we see high variability from year to year based on weather. The need for kind of overtime can impact salary and benefit costs and those sorts of things. So nothing to be concerned about from that standpoint. You can see a bit of an increase on recreational services also related to salaries. But overall, we wind up with an annual surplus on the year of 13.3 versus $13.7 million the year before. So pretty comparable year over year. Next page is the statement of changes in net financial assets. So this takes out the impact of your tangible capital assets and basically shows the impact on financial assets being cash, receivables, net of payables, deferred revenue, and debt. And you can see most of the way down this page, the increase in net financial assets, of $10.58 million, up from $5.2 the year before, primarily because of the fact that you didn't actually spend quite as much on tangible capital assets this year as last. And so that actually impacts and decreases the change in your net financial assets. I will point out at the end of 2016, the net financial position of the town was a net debt position of $5.7 million. That improved to a net debt position of $464,000 at the end of 2017, and improved all the way to a net financial asset position of $10.1 million at the end of 2018. Again, I think that the municipality's done a great job of building its reserves and reserve funds, of creating that kind of financial breathing room, if you will, to allow for a bit more discretion on operating expenses, as well as allowing for future capital expenditures as well, with monies going aside into reserves and reserve funds. And the last main statement is a statement of cash flows. The only comment I'll make here, you can see about halfway down the page, positive cash flow from operations of $16.6 million. That then gets used for financing activities, the repayment of long-term debt, which was $3.3 million. Capital activities on a net basis of $10.3 million. Those are expenditures going out the door, and then dividends coming in from Orangeville Hydro. So the net of all of that is that your cash position improved by $3.4 million from 2017 to 2018. The rest of the financial statements, there's a whole lot of information on accounting policies. There is some information that gives more detail on some of the balances in the financial statements, your temporary investments, your investment in government business enterprises, which again is Orangeville Hydro, as well as kind of the inactive on Orangeville Hydro Services Corporation. Deferred revenue note I did want to highlight very quickly. Again, it's primarily obligatory reserve funds, most of which are your development charges, but there's also building permits, recreational land, and other things. They're considered liabilities in deferred revenue because they are mandated and restricted by various legislation or your gas tax agreement, for example. But in total, deferred revenue up to $17.6 million. There's the bit of a description of the post-employment benefits, liability, and then we have the long-term debt note, and that carries over onto a second page. In total, the debts the municipality paid down over the regular repayment schedules, and we do show the expected repayments over the following 5 years and after that. I'm going to skip to the schedules just to point out that Schedule 1 shows a breakout of the revenues and expenses by department. Your tax revenue is shown all in the general government column. It's not split and allocated directly to the different departments. But you can see that the expenses are broken out various other revenues are broken out by department, and you can see those revenues. This just gives additional details, required disclosure under public sector accounting standards. And the second page of the schedule is the comparative numbers for 2017. Schedule 2 is the schedule of tangible capital assets, and you can see in total your capital assets increased because of the expenditures in the year of about $11 million, exceeding your amortization of 7.6, that you wind up with an increase in net book value up to $205 million from 202 the year before. And the last schedule before the trust fund statements is the schedule of accumulated surplus. So this breaks out the $215 million of overall accumulated surplus. Again, the vast majority of that being your investment in tangible capital assets totaling $205 million. You do have unfunded liabilities, so those are the debts used primarily to fund capital assets that are a decrease in your overall surplus. But down towards the bottom, you can see where I've pointed out the increase in your reserves and reserve funds. You can see the substantial increase, particularly in the discretionary reserve funds, from $25.7 million to $31.5. Lastly, we have the trust fund statements. There's not too much I wanted to comment on here. They are separately audited, and we have a similar audit report for those. There's several different trust funds, primarily consisting of cash and investments. And then the second page of those statements just shows the changes in those trust funds in the year, primarily some investment income, some contributions coming into those trust funds, some refunds and payments out, and the net balance of them increasing to $3.39 million from $3.25 the year before. Those are the financial statements. There's some notes again just describing some of the accounting for those trust funds. Would be glad to answer any questions now, or if you'd like me to proceed with the graphs, I'd be happy to do that as well.
Deputy Mayor McIntosh.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Through your worship to you, you touched on reserve levels a number of times. Are you able to give an opinion on our reserve levels? Do you feel they're adequate? Could they be increased or decreased?
I get asked this at most municipal council meetings. The challenge I have in answering that, and when I get to the graphs, I'll show how they compare relative to other municipalities. What I can't do, though, is tell you what's sufficient for your needs versus other municipal clients' needs. As an accountant, we look backwards and look at kind of the status of things at a point in time. We're not experts on your asset management plan and what your needs are projecting into the future to be able to say that they're sufficient or not. I can say that they have grown fairly substantially, particularly in the last handful of years. But to say whether they're sufficient or not, it would be a question for an engineer rather than an accountant, unfortunately. So I apologize about that.
Thank you. I figured I might get that answer. Thank you.
Councillor Sherwood.
Yes, through you, your worship, to Mr. Short. This is not a question, it's actually a comment. I want to thank you, your staff, and particularly our staff for bringing on this task and bringing it to us so quickly. I'm very impressed. I've lived through the auditing world, and I know that there's lots of strains on trying to get an audit done and complete their daily tasks. Having these new staff members come on and obviously step in day 2, I would imagine, to get this audit. Again, I just want to thank you very much, and I do want to congratulate staff for this well-presented report.
Councillor Taylor.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. The Deputy Mayor beat me to half of my question, which was about reserves. And Mr. Short, thank you for your presentation. You actually quoted what I hear from everyone in the municipal world. And we're outsiders. We just got voted into something. It's not, municipality isn't necessarily our expertise. We're residents of a town and we're elected. But I've heard always about it's a municipality of our size that we are within these rates. So I get the fact that you wouldn't understand the reserve funds based on the capital allocation. You wouldn't know what our strategic plan is, that sort of thing. But how about the other end of it then with the debt levels? Would you be able to comment on that based on a municipality of our size? I understand we're comfortable, but is there other comparables, or how do we know? Is there a percentage that we should be, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I can comment that, and again, when we get to the graphs, it'll show this, but your debt levels are at least comparable, in some cases a fair amount better than some of our other municipal clients. Most of our municipal clients, I will say, are smaller than the town of Orangeville. We audit a lot of the rural municipalities in Dufferin County and in Wellington County as well. So ranging from 3,000 or 4,000 up to 15,000 or 20,000, not the 25,000 that your town is. That said, we do compare based on tax base, which is our attempt to normalize for the size of the municipality. I will say your debt rate is comparable. I think that the town has used debt primarily for larger capital projects, which is what I would expect to see. Most of your capital projects are funded through existing or previously raised cash through taxes, development charges, gas tax, and those sorts of things. It's normally my recommendation to our municipal clients that debt be used only for kind of larger capital projects, which you don't necessarily have the funds set aside for. But your debt rate is comparable to what we would expect to see, and in some cases a fair amount better than some of our other municipal governments. Some of them, particularly smaller rural municipalities, are very, very reluctant to use debt, but as a result maybe are not necessarily funding their infrastructure to the extent that they should be. But your debt level is not a concern from my standpoint. The other comment I can make, and I don't have this number offhand, but when we complete the FIR, which is kind of the next step after filing these or finalizing these financial statements, and should happen within the next week or two, part of that process is a debt repayment limit, and that gives you kind of a maximum level of debt that you should be taking on. You would be well within that. I can say that with certainty.
Very good. Yeah, of course. Councillor Taylor.
So thank you for that, it's very helpful. Is there a mathematical equation that we could use? So you kind of mentioned a few things there, but would you actually take debt and divide it by revenue, or would you take debt and somehow put a dollar amount to population and say everybody owes, $1,000 and that's bad or good? And I'm just looking for some sort of, to ground it in something, and, so my limited capacity, I could understand what that was.
So we look at it as debt as a percentage of tax revenue for the municipality. So again, that's our attempt to normalize for size, but it also tells you basically how much you've incurred in debt relative to how much you're bringing in on an annual basis. Obviously, the debt is repaid over several years, but using that percentage as our attempt to normalize. If you use it based on population, that can vary pretty significantly based on kind of assessments. If you compare the tax rate here to the city of Toronto, to the city of Guelph, to the city of Kitchener, you're going to get very different tax rates. And so the amount per individual may be useful in that measure in certain circumstances. We use tax revenue as the basis, just as a comparator. But you could use any of those, and I think that it's a worthwhile exercise to look at that. When I compare to our municipalities, you're within range of what I would expect to see, but it might be a useful comparative to look at, if you take any municipality, say from 20,000 to 35,000, just so that Orangeville is kind of in the mid-range, and look at your debt levels by that basis, that might be a useful analysis as well.
Our treasurer, Nandini Syed, would like to speak to us.
And thank you, Your Worship. Through Your Worship to Councillor Taylor. So the provincial guideline for debt ceiling is 25% of own taxation, and I think that's what Mr. Short was alluding to. So that's the number, 25% of own taxation. Thank you.
Very good. One of the things that I saw kind of jumped out at me was the increase in water and wastewater reserves, which jumped by something like $4.5 million. So, Mr. Jones, I know we're going to be doing a water study coming up. Do we have enough reserves? Is there, does this work into our calculation in terms of water rates and where our water rates are going?
Your worship, absolutely it does work into it. In fact, the level of our reserves is essentially the starting point for the calculation of our water and wastewater rates. As I was alluding to a little earlier, when we're calculating water and wastewater rates, we're looking at funding not only our operating costs on an annual basis, but our long-term capital forecast as well as life cycle expenditures. And all of that goes into calculating an annualized amount of revenue that we need to collect. Some years, more revenue will go into reserves. Other years, reserves will drop because we're doing larger capital projects. But essentially, by looking at those three components, operating, long-term capital, and life cycle costs, we determine what our annualized costs will be, and our rates are based on that. But the first step, of course, is looking at what our reserves are, because that's money that we already on hand that we won't have to collect.
Right. Very good. Okay. Seeing no further questions, Mr. Short, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm sorry, Mr. Short.
I do
Okay.
apologize. We do have the graphs which we present, and again, hopefully this gives a bit more context to the numbers. May answer some of the questions, additional questions the council may have. So these graphs we present to a number of our municipal governments. First one is just showing expenditures by department with 5 years of comparatives down at the bottom. Just for reference, your municipality is more diverse than many, particularly, again, the smaller rural municipalities that we work with as well. Those would have a higher component of their expenditures being in the transportation services primarily, obviously roads being the main infrastructure in smaller rural municipalities. You're more diverse in terms of the environmental services, protection services, a broader recreation facility and capacity. So this one shows taxes receivable as a percentage of total tax revenue. So this is where I indicated that your tax receivable amount was not a concern from our standpoint. You can see that at between 5 and 10, say 7.5%, your tax receivable as a percentage of your total tax revenue is well below what other municipalities would experience. So that certainly is a positive. There's a fair amount of variability in our rural municipalities, but yours is certainly strong. Being the blue line down below means your collections on your taxes receivable is stronger than most of our municipal clients. The next graph at the bottom of the second page, which is page 221 of your council package, is capital additions versus amortization. The blue line is the additions, the red line is your amortization. So this is our best way to measure how the municipality is doing in terms of funding infrastructure. It is very subjective. I will say amortization is a subjective measure based on estimated useful lives. But generally speaking, we like to see the blue line being above the red more often than not. With most municipal clients that we have, the blue line would be above the red in, say, 3 out of 5 years. You can see that in each of the past 5 years, the blue line in your case has been above. That's part of the reason that I'm saying that the municipality has done a good job of funding its infrastructure, certainly over the past several years anyways. So the next graph shows the similar blue line being your capital asset additions, the red line being the change in capital reserves and reserve funds. The red line declining is not saying that those capital reserves and reserve funds are decreasing. It's saying that they're increasing by a smaller rate. So it is above the zero line, which is down at the bottom, meaning that in each of the past 5 years, your capital reserves and reserve funds have grown, notwithstanding the fact that you've spent a fair amount on capital asset additions over those 5 years as well. And the green line is just to show that the amount of capital grants is fairly steady and not a significant fund. It is a significant funder of your infrastructure, but it's not the primary funder. If we were looking at graphs from 2005, 2006, in that ballpark, the capital funding coming out of the federal and provincial governments would have been significantly higher. The next graph here is the long-term debt as a percentage of total tax revenue. The blue line is the town of Orangeville. The red line is the average of our clients. So you can see that your debt level is lower than the average of our clients. Some of our clients, I will mention, are fairly significantly higher than that red line. And some, as I mentioned, actually are very reluctant to take on debt and have almost or no debt, but again, may not be funding their infrastructure to the extent that they should. So I think the fact that your municipality has paid down its debt fairly significantly over the past 5 years while still funding its infrastructure commitments is certainly a positive. So the next two graphs are the status of your reserves and reserve funds. This won't answer the question whether they're sufficiently funded, because again, that's looking forward and looking at what your needs are versus what they have been in the past. So internally restricted, your reserves and reserve funds being the blue line, they are showing as being not as well funded as our other municipal clients. That's not a judgment call on how much they should be. I will comment that certainly over the past 2 or 3 years, that amount has increased very substantially. Again, you're funding your infrastructure, but also increasing those reserves and reserve funds. That is a positive, and again, it's not for me to comment on whether they're sufficiently funded or not. So I wouldn't take this to mean in any way that they're not sufficiently funded because the blue line is below the red. Externally restricted is your development charges, gas tax, and other reserve funds mandated by legislation and other agreements. And you can see that it's very comparable to our other municipal clients. This one, it's hard to take much information from this one because of the relative size of your municipality versus other clients. So I think I'll skip over it with your permission. But I think the last graph is worth pointing out. So this is showing basically the aging of your infrastructure. So what we're doing in this graph is comparing the original cost versus the amortized cost of your infrastructure. And so what this is saying is that the amortized cost of the town of Orangeville's infrastructure is at about 60% of its original cost, meaning it's been amortized by about 40%. The average of our other municipalities is about 57%, so your infrastructure, you could argue, is less amortized. I don't know that you could necessarily infer that as directly, again, because amortization is a subjective measure. But what I can say, again, because of the capital expenditures over the past several years, that the municipality has done a good job of funding its infrastructure. And I think this does give some evidence of that, but there is some subjectivity to it. And those are the graphs, and that's my presentation, unless there are any further questions.
Councillor Sherwood.
Yes, through you, Your Worship, to Mr. Short or perhaps staff. Could we go back to the graph, please, of the expenditures by department? Excuse my ignorance here, but can you tell me what the expenses for health services are? I see it's 0.2%. It's very insignificant, but what exactly is health services?
That, I believe, I'm going to have to try and find it. I believe there's some costs for, is it cemeteries and things like that would be grouped in that. I'm not sure. I know with a number of our, because it's such a small percentage, to be honest, I didn't look at that specifically in preparing for today's presentation. I'll see what I can find very quickly for you here, though.
Perhaps that's something we could just find out later on.
Right.
Thank you.
Very good. Okay, so there's a, I'm sorry?
Yes. So, through your worship, it's on page 207 of your package. It does have a description of what health services entails.
So the recommendation here is that the report CPS TF 2019-19 dated July 15th, 2019, the 2018 audited financial statements of the town of Orangeville be received, and the council approve the audited consolidated financial statement of the corporation of the town of Orangeville and the statement of trust funds as presented. We have a motion. Counselor Peters, seconded by Counselor Andrews. Any further comments? Call a vote. All in favor? Okay, thank you, Mr. Short. We have, yeah, I think, folks, we're going to have a 5-minute health break right now, please, and we'll carry on in 5 minutes. Thank you. Okay, moving along on our agenda, we have no consent motions, and we're moving into staff reports now. 10.1 is a signed variance application from Headwaters Healthcare Foundation, and recommendation that a signed variance application be approved and that council permit an additional ground sign of approximately 12 feet by 8 feet to be erected at 100 Rolling Hills Drive at the intersection of Highways 10 and 9, conditional upon a sign installer's license being obtained by the contractor and a sign permit being obtained. Councillor Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Certainly in support of the sign itself. What I didn't see under the recommendation, but I believe was in the report, perhaps it could be clarified by the clerk or the CAO, was built into the recommendation of the report, I believe, was waiving of the fees. Could I just get confirmation on that before I make my next comment?
The fees are waived as it relates to the sign permit itself, but not for the sign installer's license, because there's an exemption within your sign bylaw for this type of organization, but the sign installer's bylaw does not provide the same type of an exemption.
Okay. And so does that have to be part of the motion that's made by accepting the recommendation in the report?
If it's council's decision that they wanted to provide the exemption for the fee for the sign installer's license, that would need to be added to the recommendation.
Okay, sorry, now it gets to the question. I also read that it went through, I guess, provincial or MTO approval. Presumably, they also have a fee associated with signage or erection of signage. Is that also correct?
There was a link, I think, in there which showed with an invoice, a receipt.
Okay.
Was part of it.
Apologies if I missed that. I just wanted to. Okay, because I was balancing obviously the nature of the request against the other procedures that they'd had to go through so far. So, okay, I'm up to date. Thank you.
Councillor Andrews.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. And just following on Councillor Peters' comments and question, I am glad that the MTO permit has been processed, because it's, typical process when you end up having something of the size. Would you know if, and I'm not sure who this would be posed to, if there's going to be a rotation of the visual ads? In our package, we only saw a couple, and not sure about the length of time that these particular signs will be there. Is there going to be a rotation of messaging?
That wasn't included in the application itself, but I can tell you that typically there is a rotation on the actual sign face replacement.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Deputy Mayor McIntosh.
Yes, through you, Your Worship, I'd like to make a motion that we agree to this and also waive the fee for the installer, as they aren't charging any fee for installing it.
Right. Okay. I just want to make a comment that sign contractor's fee, I think it's more of a penalty to small businesses in this town. There's only 2 or 3 sign contractors that we have in our town. I know that we're going to revisit the sign law going forward, and it would be my recommendation that we get rid of that extra $300 fee for a sign contractor going forward. So I would support what Deputy Mayor McIntosh says there, essentially waiving the fees entirely for this permit. The other thing I wanted to, I see some folks from Headwaters here, Nicole and others are here. I was in the sign business for 30 years. The graphic that you've got there, although it looks great on paper, it's extremely busy. And I'm just telling you, it would be better to try and simplify the graphic, because you've got vehicles going by at 60, 70, 80 kilometers an hour. And it just my thought on the process. You can take it for what it's worth, but if you're going to get a message across, it's got to get across quickly and boldly. So that's my suggestion to you. Councillor Sherwood.
Yes, Your Worship, to the clerk. I was just trying to confirm that this is a permanent sign. There's no intention of this sign ever coming down at any point in time.
That's correct. That's my understanding.
Thank you.
Councillor Taylor.
Your Worship. Thinking about the sign, I want to state unequivocally that I support Headwaters Health Services. I was there myself just recently as a patient. Lots of fun. They're very kind. However, to waive the sign bylaw fees, I feel like it's a very unpopular measure, and I applaud what you're saying, Your Worship, about reviewing them. I recently had a conversation with Power Orangeville resident Howard Buck, who just moved into his new business in the Walmart Plaza. Everyone who needs glasses should go and see him. He had quite a time getting a sign and had to pay a fair amount of money to be able to have that sign installed. Again, value for Howard and his business, value for Headwaters and their business. I just don't think it's right to pick and choose, and for that reason, I will be voting against it. However, I love Headwaters, but I just feel we need to be fair and equitable, because I also think highly of Howard and his business.
Right. I'm with you there, certainly, but I think our healthcare service is under financial pressure. They're always trying to raise money. It's a continual battle for them. We've already had Stacey Dobb in front of us recently talking about funding, and they're unsure of what their new funding model is going to be. They're underfunded based on the provincial average here. So I think, you know, being at as I said, a government service as opposed to private business, I would support not charging them. So, is there a motion on the floor here? Okay, so we had a seconder. I'll second it if we haven't already. So let's call the vote on that. All in favor? Opposed? Fair enough. Motion passes. Moving on, 10.2, 2019 Business Improvement Area Levy. Is there anybody here from the BIA? No, okay. Just Deb. So, councillors, the BIA has spent in the order of $460,000 a year for the past long time, at least 5 years that I'm aware of. And I don't recall that they present anything to town council in terms of what their plans are, right, in their budget. Councillor Sherwood, can you confirm? Do you know?
Well, Your Worship, when we attended the general meeting in January, we were presented with the financials and the budget then.
Right, but that was their general meeting. I'm just wondering, we're overseeing spending in this town, and that essentially we're handing them $460,000 and do it with it you please, correct? I mean, Councillor Sherwood.
If I could confirm with the clerk, you received minutes from our meetings, and I know we had a detailed budget that showed every single expenditure and projected revenue in that. And was that accompanying with those minutes, do you know, Madam Clerk?
Actually, I wouldn't be able to answer that question in absolute terms. I do know, and I believe it was the meeting I was at in June, that you actually received some of the BIA minutes.
Yeah.
In terms of whether that covered when they actually had their meeting with respect to their budget, I wouldn't be able to answer that at this point.
I guess what I'm getting at is, would it be, I think it'd be nice to have the BIA, you know, come and talk to us and present their budget for 2020, for instance, and what their plans are. And I mean, as it stands right now, we're about to approve them spending $460,000. I'd like to hear more about it, though, and it's not, you know, that I'm going to be making any changes to what their plan is, but we're here in an oversight position, and it's a lot of money, and I'd like to hear more about what their plans are with that money.
Well, Your Worship, if it is the wishes of council, definitely as a member of the council representative on that board, I could gladly bring that forward to them.
Okay. I'm just wondering, though, that we're about to pass a bylaw here. Councillor Peters would like to weigh in.
Sorry, this probably isn't going to further the conversation you started, but just while we're talking procedurally, I was curious if it was a product of perhaps some of the staff positions that we've turned over recently. But, you know, it took a while to see this. As you said, Councillor Sherwood, we were there in the winter when this was approved. I imagine it would have come to us earlier in the year on a standard year, perhaps. I'm not sure. Mr. Brennan, can you comment on the timing? It would seem we could have seen this several months ago and gotten it out of the way rather than be halfway through the fiscal year before it was presented.
Your Worship, through you, I cannot recall. I would have to go back and check as well. Like Councillor Sherwood, I've seen the numbers presented at their annual AGM of the BIA in previous years. And really what we're doing here is approving the bylaw so that we can collect the taxes and so we can get the bills out. If we request BIA to come back and present to council or not, I think the important thing to remember is that their board and their membership votes on their proposed budget as well. So
maybe what I'm suggesting is maybe adding onto this, maybe a friendly add-on that before the end of September that the BIA could come back to us and give their a presentation of what their plans are for 2020. You talked earlier today about the Sunday opening and the initiative that they've got with buskers. It's exciting stuff. I'd like to learn more. I'd like to hear more about what their plans are because, you know, maybe there's some other synergies. If they present something in September for 2020, maybe some Central Counties tourism or Headwaters tourism or our economic development people can get on board and we can work collaboratively to help, you know, make more of a success, whatever their plans are. So that's all I'd like to hear more. So, Councillor Sherwood.
Yes, Your Worship. I was just going to express, add a little bit more with Mr. Brennan. This is just to enable them to do the final tax billing. The budget amount, the 460, has been known for several months, and I really would have hoped that it would have been added to the minutes. I'd have to go back to see. I know I have that detail as a member, but I will definitely take your concerns and recommendations back to the next board meeting for sure.
Okay, but would it be acceptable if we added onto this that they would come back to us within the next, say, till the end of September, sometime in that time frame? And okay, Councillor Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and apologies not to disagree with the sentiment. I agree. I'd like to see what their plans are, but given that we won't even have a 2020 budget by them, I find it probably unlikely that the BIA will have their plans laid out for next year by September, especially since the budget wouldn't be passed until the new year when they hold their AGM. So it may be premature to put an exact date on it. Perhaps we could work that out through the board meeting process.
Okay, so maybe I'll let Councillor Taylor have his say. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think what you're saying, Your Worship, and I believe I'm in alignment with you, is that we'd like a closer relationship with the BIA, and we'd like to work well with them. We'd like to help where we can possibly, and I think communication feels like it could be a little bit closer, and whether the budgets are done or not, perhaps there's just a presentation of what they're working on and how we can help and how we can work well with them. That's what I would prefer.
Okay, so maybe I'll correct what I've just said here. Maybe we'll just pass this, we'll pass that thought on to you, if you can bring that up. But sometime in late 2019, we'd like to see the BIA in front of us and talk about their plans for 2020. That's okay. So, that being said, we do have a recommendation here. I guess I can make a motion to, as is written here in our agenda. We have a seconder, Councillor Peters. Any further discussion? All in favor? Okay, great. Moving on. 10.3, update on uncommitted reserve capacity at our water pollution control plant. Read this with great interest, so it looks to me like we're in good shape there, Mr. Jones, with respect to our water capacity. Can you comment briefly on your report, sir?
Certainly, Your Worship. Ultimately, this is a report that we prepare on an annual basis to review the status of our sewage treatment capacity. which is in some ways a measure, along with the uncommitted water supply capacity, of our ability to service additional growth. We are just doing the final sweeping and mopping, as it were, in the expansion of the water pollution control plant, and in the report you can see that we've now increased our rated capacity of the facility from 14,400 cubic meters per day to 17,500 cubic meters per day, which was the capacity that was determined through our long-term servicing strategy that we would need to service the remaining undeveloped lands within the town of Orangeville, and that appears to be where we are at now. We have sufficient sewage treatment capacity to service those remaining lands.
Great. Thank you very much. Councillor Sherwood.
Through you, Your Worship, to Mr. Jones. I take, I'm just going into part of your report here, and I'm asking, is staff asking in the comments, staff suggest it be appropriate to review and update the servicing allocation policy for council consideration? Are you needing us to move a motion on this, to do this?
Mr. Jones.
Sorry. Through you, Your Worship, to Councillor Sherwood, no, we're not asking that. That is something that we are going to be doing. Several years ago, when it was not clear whether we were going to ultimately be able to get approval to expand our water pollution control plant, a decision was made to allocate the remaining capacity at the plant very carefully, and that formed the basis for our sewage treatment allocation policy. It focused primarily on sewage treatment because that was the limiting factor. With the expansion being complete, that approach really isn't appropriate any longer. Water is more of a concern than sewage treatment capacity at this point, and by putting that into this report as well as the next report, we're simply letting council know that this is something that is top of mind in infrastructure services, and we do expect to be coming back in the future with a new servicing allocation policy that recognizes these changes that have occurred.
Very good. So if I could make a suggestion here and combine 10.3 and 10.4, which was the recommendation to receive the reports on uncommitted reserve capacity at the water pollution control plant and the water supply capacity as a combined approval. Councillor Sherwood, one more time.
Yes, Your Worship. If I didn't realize you were going to put the next report in, I have a question with regard to the next report, if I could as well.
Go right ahead.
In point 5, there's mentioned the well was rehabilitated, but is currently able to substantially produce only half of its permitted capacity. What are the future consequences of this only operating at half of its capacity, Mr. Jones?
Mr. Jones.
Through your worship to Councillor Sherwood, that certainly is a concern for infrastructure services. Well 6 has posed some challenges over the years, and we expect that we are going to need to do significant investigations and look into what needs to be done to bring its capacity back up to where it has been historically. It could take some time, and it may be out of service for a period of time once we start moving forward with a plan of that sort. And staff suggests that at this time it would be more appropriate to wait until we've added an additional source of supply to our system before we move forward with changes at well 6.
Okay, so we have a motion on the floor to accept these two reports, seconded by Councillor Andrews. Any further discussion? All in favor? Okay, so that was 10.3 and 10.4. Moving on to 10.5. This is a report regarding a zoning application at 279 Broadway. Yeah, okay, so Councillor Peters is motioning to approve this, seconded by Councillor Sherwood. All in favor? Very good. 10.6. This is demolition at 11 Zina Street. This is the small garage that was around the back on the laneway. Councillor Sherwood is making a motion here to accept this and approve it, seconded by Councillor Taylor. All in favor? 10.7, Orangeville Police Services Board. This is the financial implications of the new cannabis provincial legislation, and that the council requests the town of Orangeville Treasury transfer an amount of $13,881 from corporate allocations to the Orangeville Police Service to assist with training and enforcement of the new cannabis laws. May I have a motion? Councillor Andrews, seconded by Deputy Mayor McIntosh. All in favor? 10.8, this is information sharing protocol. For those of you that don't know, City of Peterborough requested improved communication of information from their police service, and this has come as a result of that. So this new bylaw is based on the City of Peterborough's changes. I think it's very good. I think that it requires the police service to provide us with more timely information more frequently. I think it's a good thing. May I have a motion? Councillor Taylor, second by Councillor Post. All in favor? Thank you. Moving on to 11.1, Committee of Adjustment minutes to be received. May I have a motion? Councillor Taylor, seconded by Councillor Peters. All in favor? Cultural Plan Task Force minutes. Recommendation that these minutes be received as well. Councillor Post, seconded by Councillor Andrews. All in favor? Thank you. Question period. Anybody in the audience would like to speak? Mr. Patterson, you made it on time for this, my friend. Thank you. Thank you.
It was a long way do these meetings usually run this late?
No, surprisingly, they don't. But
okay, well, I guess I made it to the long
lucky.
one.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me here tonight. I was sharing with a few of you that this is my first time in council in Orangeville.
Mm-hmm.
Officially, I've popped in and out in the past as I worked for the town as an intern after being a college dropout.
Mm-hmm.
They still gave me an opportunity when I was 19. And I cherish that experience so greatly.
Great.
I'll just hop into some of the notes that I've made here, and I'll keep this as short for you guys because it's been a really long night, and if you're half as tired as I am, that's an issue. I apologize, I am prepared. Maybe not as much as I want it to be. All right, I'm gonna have to just wing this.
Okay.
Sod it. I'm here tonight basically to introduce myself to you. I've been reflecting all day about exactly what I wanted to say here tonight, and I think I just want to keep it simple, because that's pretty much how I operate these days. I'm in recovery from many things. I'm receiving convalescent care right now so that I can heal and recover properly. I've been living back in Orangeville for just over 2 years. I moved back in April of 2017 after having spent 10 years in Muskoka, where I discovered great success, love, marriage, harmony, beautiful things. Prior to that, I have spent the 18 years prior to that mostly out of the country. Some of it here in Orangeville, some of it in Canada, some of it in a multitude of provinces. I spent a great deal of time working on cruise ships in a critical care position in security. I took care of our most vulnerable part of our society, which was youth. I experienced great traumas. Through those experiences, I'm healing. I'm in my home. I have my brand new, beautiful council. And I just happened to have voted for every single one of you. How the hell did that happen? God happened. Your worship, I apologize, I didn't greet you from the beginning the way I should have. My conversation needs to mostly be with you because you're the one I'm here appealing to today.
Okay.
Specifically, with the guidance of my friend Lisa Post, who is mostly our cultural representative, and others who I have connected with. Grant, I know that you are mostly our environmental green, looking out for betterment of future developments. I really respect that. Thank you for taking time to connect with me. I've served your mother at Deja Vu Diner weekly with her girlfriends. Todd, I ran into you at Rib Fest last summer. You were volunteering. I took time to notice. Mr. Deputy Mayor, you've probably had the most impact on me in my life. I watch back. I have sometimes judged your methods, but I've found a peace where I accept them because I see the beauty that you're doing for this town. Thank you. Miigwech. Debbie, I've only met you once really officially at Deja Vu where I introduced myself, but it was still meaningful, and I look forward to getting to know you more. Joe, I'm not even going to get started because I'll talk to you afterwards, if that's okay, if you have time. I'm not even going to waste everyone's time right now. My humble, dedicated town staff and everybody else who assists this brand new, beautiful council with doing the things that they're placed here to do by God makes you humble servants. Always know what your duty is to them to serve so that they can protect and guide and love and make all the decisions that are vital and critical, urgent to solving some of the problems that are occurring in this town. And you all know what I'm talking about. Drugs, rape, sex trafficking.
Okay. Mr. Patterson?
Yes.
It's been a long night, sir.
So let's head out.
This is question period, sir.
So my
Appreciate
question to
this-
you,
yeah.
my question to you,
Please.
thank you for your patience, your worship, is through my connections with you, I would simply like to know how I can best serve my town through service.
Okay.
So if you can all take that into consideration and reach out to me in your own time, when time allows, and let me know how I can help, that would be great. Your worship, I ask only you tonight, how may I serve you?
Well, that's a tall question. There's a lot of volunteer positions here, Wayne. I think we'll all discuss your request here. There's lots of groups that need additional help, service clubs, and but thank you. I know you're obviously very passionate about the youth in our town. You've got some real world experience that you'll bring to bear, and we understand that, sir. So, yeah. But thank you very much for offering, and I'm sure we'll be able to find some places for you to help and
Thank you.
build our town.
Thank you. Let's
Thank
get
you
the
for
hell
coming.
out of here.
Thank you very much for coming in. Appreciate it. Okay. Moving along, we have correspondence, and we've received a number of pieces of correspondence. We've got 13.1 through 13.4. Any councillors wish to comment on any of these correspondence? So we have a motion to receive. Councillor Andrews, seconded by Councillor Post. All in favor? I'm sorry, Councillor Taylor. Sir.
Thank you, Your Worship. Not to belabor the point, you know, as a counselor and a representative of the town of Orangeville and someone who thinks highly of the library, I did send a note to the chair and I always get Darla's title confused,
CEO.
CEO. And I'd just like to say publicly, I'm disappointed in Amaranth for the way that they've dealt with the library board for the town of Orangeville. They're nickel and diming, really, and not negotiating in good faith. I hope they're listening to me. I'm not on the board, so I'll just be an outsider offering a voice. But they're hurting their own residents by doing what they're doing and having to charge them the $10 fee. All other municipalities within Dufferin County have worked with us to make sure that this library is sustained and are doing a good job with it. And I'd just like to publicly say that I'm disappointed in Amaranth and their leadership on this issue.
Very good, sir. I do know that they are under some unusual pressures right now because of some issues that have occurred. So I know that this year, I think, maybe is a little bit of an anomaly for town of Amaranth. So, but thank you for your comment, Councillor Taylor. So we did vote on that, I believe. Oh, I'm sorry, Madam Clerk.
Yes, you did. If I may, Mr. Mayor, I will just need you to pass a separate resolution with respect to the Integrity Commissioner correspondence.
Okay, we will do that. So let me just read this. The recommendation is that the council directs the Integrity Commissioner to include in the relevant statement of account the surname of the member who made a request for advice under paragraphs 4, 5, 6 of subsection 223.3 of the Municipal Act, provided that confidentiality is maintained and that the Integrity Commissioner reveals no information about the nature of the request or the content of the advice. Any comments or questions about that? May I have a motion? Councillor Andrews, second Councillor Peters, all in favor? Thank you, Madam Clerk. Councillor Taylor.
Sorry to belabor the evening, everyone. 13.4, I know that Mr. Kirk is passionate about the town. I also know Mr. Kirk watches council. Had discussions with him during the election time period, and I think it's important that residents understand and know that when correspondence like this comes across, council reads them and takes them into account. I thought the letter was well written. I think council's come back with an appropriate response, and we're taking a different tact, which was done, in my mind, prior to receiving the letter from Mr. Kirk, but it doesn't matter. I just encourage residents that if they want to link in with town, have a look at what Mr. Kirk sent and feel free to do the same on whatever issue is of importance to you. So kudos to Mr. Kirk for the way that he's communicated, and I appreciate his message.
Well said. Thank you. All right, we have some information items here. 14.1, OBIAA Digital Service Squad Grant Agreement. We also have 14.2, which is a report on new businesses in Orangeville from our Economic Development Department. And we also have a biannual building activity report and a recommendation that the information items listed above be received. May I have a motion? Councillor Sherwood, seconded by Deputy Mayor McIntosh. Any comments or questions on those items? No. Call the vote. Councillor Andrews.
Very quickly, I just wanted to again acknowledge the work that the Economic Development Office has done to provide this information. And it truly is encouraging when you end up seeing new businesses, investment in our community. It's a very positive story. And I think that we're all embracing that, not only on council, staff, and the community.
Right. And following on that, Councillor Andrews, the biannual building activity report was quite positive, quite a jump from last year to this year. So it's all good news on the economic front in Orangeville. So we've had the motion seconded. All in favor? Okay, thank you. Item 15.1, this is notice of motion given prior to the meeting. And 15.1 is Councillor Post regarding accessible parking. Councillor Post.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor. I'll just go ahead and read my motion that I gave notice to at the last meeting. regarding accessible parking, and as chairs of the Accessibility and Age-Friendly Committee, it was brought to our attention at that committee that there was a bit of an issue when it comes to accessible parking in the downtown core, specifically when it relates to road closures in the area, and the reduction that then happens of some of the accessible parking spaces that exist currently. So my motion is that council direct staff to investigate and report to council regarding, number one, the feasibility of temporarily relocating accessible parking spaces during events and road closures in the downtown area, and number two, the practices of other municipalities that allow vehicles with accessible parking permits to park in certain no parking areas.
Councillor Andrews.
I would be honored to second that motion. Great idea, and I think that flexibility provides the appropriate support for those that require it in our community.
It would also be interesting, Mr. Jones, I guess there'll be some sort of financial implication, but you'll have that in a report anyway. There's going to have to be some signage, portable signage, something as part of this, so be interesting to hear. But it certainly, when you explained it to all of us, it, you know, it was made a lot of common sense that we're busy blocking off accessible spaces during events, and we need to be cognizant of that going forward, so thank you. Okay, any further commentary? All in favor? Thank you. Item 15.2 is notice of motion given prior to meeting by Councillor Sherwood regarding water billing amnesty. Councillor Sherwood.
Yes, Your Worship. I will read my motion. Whereas the town has received concerns with regards to water meters and the town's water rates bylaw, and whereas the town passed bylaw 20-2015, which establishes the water and wastewater rates for the period of 2015 to 2019, and whereas town staff are scheduled to report back to council regarding an updated water and wastewater rate study, which will result in an update to the water and wastewater rate bylaw, including the rates for the next 5 years. And now, therefore, Council of the Town of Orangeville requests staff to include, when reporting back to Council on the water and wastewater rates, the following: options to allow a one-time amnesty for high water consumption outside of normal water consumption levels, and what will be the budgetary impact. I'm looking to my colleagues for a seconder.
Deputy Mayor McIntosh.
I'll actually second this.
Sorry. There you go.
Thank you, Worship. I'll actually second this. I do have some concerns, though. A one-time amnesty. We've just heard from Mrs. Sherman tonight that our water rates are very high. And any amnesties we're going to be giving for people that have faulty water softeners, faulty toilets, is going to fall right back on the taxpayer. And I don't think that's right. We'll look into it. Obviously, I'll support this motion and look into it. But, you know, all I hear is people say, well, we got a plumber in to look at everything, and they said it was okay. I've spoken to Mr. Jones. Nobody has given us a letter from a plumber saying everything is okay. You know, it's all hearsay. So I'm not really in favor of any sort of amnesty unless it's a town problem. But again, I'll support this motion as it is. Thank you.
I can add a little bit to this. I know Mr. Coco, who's in the back of the room there, president of Orangeville Hydro. Fortunately or unfortunately, Mr. Coco's staff receives the brunt of the collection calls when these things happen, and he's been working hard on it, and he brought to our attention the City of London has an amnesty program, and if you read through that program, there's a lot of hurdles that one must go over in order to get relief. So I think, again, we're going to rely on our staff to compare not only City of London but any other municipalities in Southern Ontario that have such a program and bring it back to us for our consideration. But you know, there'll be conditions that have to be met in order to get relief, I believe. So, any further comments on that? So we'll call a vote. All in favor? Thank you. Any notices of motion at meeting? Councillor Taylor.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. Before I share my notice of motion, I just want to share a little bit of background about how I see things, and certainly council can disagree with me if they feel it's appropriate, but I think what we all committed to do when we came in here as councillors was, A, be respectful, be professional, be fact-based in our decision-making, and I feel good that this council has done that, and B was, be mindful of the taxpayer. Let's be thinking about different ways that, A, we can save money, but B, also think strategically and long-term about our decisions that we're making. And 3 examples that come to mind where we've done that. Right now, we have a very divisive debate about the police. You know, no one up here is giving opinions on what that is. We don't have the facts. We're going to figure that out as we go along, but deciding what the financial implications of that could be. There's a recreation study that's going on right now that's going to tell us what we need to do moving forward with that. And then we just had discussions tonight about water. So in the spirit of that, you know, I offer the following motion, which I do not want to take credit for. We did have some closed meeting discussions. It's a council discussion, not a Todd Taylor. You know, it's all of us. Thank you. I'm just the speaker on behalf of council. But notice of motion is that Orangeville Council would investigate a partnership or sale of all parts of the Orangeville Railway Development Corporation.
I would like to, well, it's notice of motion at meeting, so it'll be dealt with next, yeah, so, thank you. Moving on. Any unfinished business that anybody is aware of? Any new business anybody wishes to bring forward? Okay, we have confirming bylaws, number 19. May I have a motion to approve that? Councillor Post, seconded by Councillor Andrews. All in favor? May I have a motion to adjourn? Deputy Mayor McIntosh, seconded by Councillor Sherwood, I think. All in favor? All right, thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.